record this. All right. So the reading tonight, as we're going to see in a few moments, is David's exploration around loneliness, both as a difficulty but also a gift. And I was thinking about what to share tonight as I read David's essay this week and thought about it. And I'll kind of close with one of my own poems that I sent out on being alone, holding the tension for me with two different words that can sound similar, but they're very different for me. And playing with those two words. But actually, where it was surprising to me this week, where I went with it was out of my own religious tradition. So I'm going to sound a bit like a bit like a preacher tonight. I understand the Gospels and the stories of Jesus to be quite poetic and mythic. I've always seen them that way. I've always preached on them that way. But when I was thinking about the most powerful story in my life of what it means to be alone, I often turn to the gospel stories. Jesus, at the beginning of before he's healing anyone, before he goes out preaching, before he starts his whole public life, the story is, and it's quite symbolic, he goes out into the desert for 40 days and he fasts and he encounters the shadow, and there's temptation stories. He's very weak at the end of the experience, so weak that even angels have to come and kind of take care of him at the end because he's starved himself for 40 days, which is, if number 40 is very important in the story, linking back to the Torah, kind of echoing memories in the Jewish tradition. So you have this lonely story right at the very beginning, deeply lonely. And then all through the stories, he's taking off and disappearing and going off on his own constantly. Whenever the public pressure, whenever the misunderstanding of his friends is too much for him to stand, you can feel the emotion in him, sometimes the anger, sometimes the sadness, the heartbreak. But he has to be by himself to recharge, rediscover his vocation, to be able to come back again and re-engage. And he has to do that. And then the very last night, and even in the last moments of his death, it's all about alone and loneliness. He's sort of abandoned by his friends. He's alone in the garden, trying to escape his fate, trying to find a way out, kind of reconciling himself to it in the end. And then, one of the last words during the crucifixion, he cries out a passage from the Hebrew poetry and in the Aramaic language, and he says basically, God, you've abandoned me. There's this sort of abandonment at the very last moment of his death too. So I think about how in the Christian tradition, Jesus is the model for what it means to stand at the intersection between humanity and the divine, and revealing a life dedicated to compassion and justice. And that story is full of aloneness. And I don't know, I've always found deep comfort from it, even as a kid. Just Jesus is doing all of this time by himself, trying to figure out, and then this ending is in this kind of loneliness. And I've seen it as a hospice chaplain as well, how in the end there's this lonely, alone place. No matter, people were surrounded by their families, but death itself is this moment that happens all through life of being alone, but it's more poignant, more revealed in that final moment. Yeah, so that's kind of where I went this week, and thinking, it was surprising to me how powerful those stories from the Gospels have been for me. Feeling a deep empathy for the character of Jesus, and in my own life, and now parallel some of those experiences have been. I mentioned Parker Palmer earlier too, and Parker's teaching about community of solitudes. Um, One other thing I did want to mention tonight, when Parker was working with us and trying to, give us a sense of how to guide these encounters, I really appreciate one of the things he said, which is that, if you find that you're running short on time, and you find maybe things have gone longer than you planned them to be in the structure or the flow that you've created, never cheat on the solitude time, the time for people to have to be alone. Like, the group time seems like sometimes that's where all the really good stuff happens, because that's where things come to the surface and can be named and described, and people can hear themselves into being, and that's all very powerful. But it's the it's the moment of solitude, and I think what Parker was referring to, David says much in a poetic way, which is that when I'm alone, my body is not a statement, it's a question. So just to have the time to have that question, which is actually embedded or revealed in my body itself. And when I'm with other people, my body is trying to always sort of say something. But when I'm alone, I'm allowed to receive the question even through my body. So, um, so try to sustain that practice of giving people, ample opportunity in a retreat setting where we don't shortchange the alone time. Okay. And let me just close now with one of my haikus. This one I wrote quite a while ago, and it's just this very simple one about the tension. I'm using two different terms. One, both about being alone. One is lonely, and one is solitude. I guess one way to describe them is, one is that involuntary, forced upon abandonment, sort of aching, very difficult place of not being accepted, not being wanted, finding myself completely isolated. And then the other of choice, of sort of voluntary, willing place, which I often have mentioned in the Jesus stories, which is wanting to be reconnected to something deeper, and then carrying that solitude, not just in the desert or mountain, use David's language, but every moment at the kitchen table, or in the marriage and friendship. So, all right. So let me share my screen, and I'll just read this simple haiku to close us off for this reflection, and then we'll jump into David's reading here. So this is haiku 13. Alone. And alone can be either a time of loneliness or a time of solitude. Can be forsaken by others, forgotten, longing for warmth, unsafe, full of fears, isolated, lonely. Can also be purifying, vibrant, silent presence, awareness, respite, clarifying, an eye in the storm, solitude. I've known both. Yeah, right. So the reading, again, let's hear it read aloud. And I think there's a real value in hearing the reading aloud. And it's a longer reading. So if we want to do it in a few different voices, that would be great. But if someone is really flowing with it, you can keep going too. That's not a problem. There's no requirement that it has to be multiple voices. But if you feel like you've read a section and you're good, you can just pass the baton, and then we'll let the next runner take the next leg. So alone. So whoever like to start us off, I'll just start the first part of it up here, and then invite you to read.
We'll start out. Alone is a word that stands by itself, carrying the austere, solitary beauty of its own meaning, even as it is spoken to another. It is a word that can be felt at the same time as an invitation to depth and as an imminent threat, as in all alone, with its returned echo of abandonment. Alone is a word that rings with a strange finality, especially when contained in that haunting aggregate left all alone. As if the state once experienced begins to define and engender its own inescapable world. The first step in spending time alone is to admit how afraid of it we are. I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks, Dan. Invite another voice now to take it from there.
Being alone is a difficult discipline. A beautiful and difficult sense of being solitary is always the ground from which we step into a contemplative intimacy with the unknown. But the first portal of aloneness is often experienced as a gateway to alienation, grief, and abandonment. To find ourselves alone or to be left alone is an ever-present, fearful, and abiding human potentiality, of which we are often unconsciously and deeply afraid. To be alone for any length of time is to shed an outer skin. The body is inhabited in a different way when we are alone than when we are with others. Alone, we live in our bodies as a question rather than a statement. The permeability of being alone asks us to reimagine ourselves, to become impatient with ourselves, to tire of the same old story, and then slowly, hour by hour, to start to tell the story in a different way, as other parallel ears, ones we were previously unaware of, begin to listen to us more carefully in the silence. For a solitary life to flourish, even if it is only for a few precious hours, aloneness asks us to make a friend of silence. And just as importantly, to inhabit that silence in our own particular way, to find our very own way into our own particular and even virtuoso way of being alone. I'll hand off here.
Thanks, Jay. That's great.
To inhabit silence in our aloneness is to stop telling the story altogether. To begin with, aloneness always leads to rawness and vulnerability, to a fearful simplicity, to not recognizing and to not knowing, to the wish to find any company other than that not knowing, unknown self, looking back at us in the silent mirror. One of the elemental dynamics of self-compassion is to understand our deep reluctance to be left to ourselves. Aloneness begins in puzzlement at our own reflection, transits through awkwardness and even ugliness at what we see, and culminates one appointed hour or day in a beautiful, unlooked for surprise at the new complexion beginning to form, the slow knitting together of an inner life now exposed to air and light. I'll pass now.
Thanks, Sophia.
To be alone is not necessarily to be absent from the company of others. The radical step is to let ourselves alone, to cease the berating voice that is constantly trying to interpret and force the story from too small and too complicated a perspective. Even in company, a sense of imminent aloneness is a quality that can be cultivated. Aloneness does not need a desert or a broad ocean or a quiet mountain. Human beings have the ability to feel the rawest, intimate forms of aloneness whilst living closely with others or beset by the busyness of the world. They can feel alone around a meeting table, in the happiest, most committed marriage, or aboard a crowded ship with a full complement of crew. The difficulty of being alone may be felt most keenly in the most intimate circumstances, in the darkness of the marriage bed, 1 centimeter and 1,000 miles apart, or in the silence around a tiny, crowded kitchen table. But to feel alone in the presence of others is also to understand the singularity of human existence, whilst experiencing the deep physical current that binds us to others. Whether we want that binding or no, aloneness can measure togetherness even through a sense of distance. I'll let someone else finish it up.
Thanks, Alyssa.
At the beginning of the 21st century, to feel alone or want to be alone is deeply unfashionable. To admit feeling alone is to reject and betray others, as if they are not good company and do not have the entertaining, interesting lives of their own to distract us. And to actually seek to be alone is a radical act. To want to be alone is to refuse a certain kind of conversational hospitality and to turn to another door and another kind of welcome, not necessarily defined by human vocabulary. It may be that time away from a work, an idea of ourselves, or a committed partner is the very essence of appreciation for the other, for the work and for the life of another. To be able to let them alone as we let ourselves alone, to live something that feels like a choice again, to find ourselves alone as a look for achievement, not a state to which we've been condemned.
Thanks, Philippa, for the last reading there. And I realized that somewhere in the PowerPoint, the reflection questions got cut off tonight. So I'm going to just remind us what the questions were. And I had them to put in here for tonight. So let me just grab them. Sorry about that. I will pop them in the chat though. They're quite simple. One is, when do I feel most alone? And then the second question is playing with the word solitude. What have I learned from solitude? So let me just put those in the chat so you've got them there. So when do I feel most alone? And what have I learned from solitude? Okay. And let's take about 10 minutes of time. So if you'd like to turn off your cameras and have the 10 minutes of solitude to reflect on solitude and think about being alone by being alone, try just those 10 minutes and see what they offer you, see what comes up. You could also just look over, if you've got a copy of Constellations, you could scan over David's writing again and just see if something else comes up for you. Yeah. So what have you taken away from the experience of being alone or experiencing solitude in your life? And maybe a time when that has been poignant and you've been aware of that and you can remember that. That might be helpful to go back into that memory. All right. So we've got some time and we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. So I've got about 7:23, so 7:33 Pacific time, something around there. I'll turn my camera on and you hear my voice again. Okay, blessings on your time.